I'm taking the jewels. Grandma only left her old cookbooks, Vivian whispered to her friends, loud enough for half the funeral parlor to hear. The sound of her voice cut through my grief like a knife, and I felt my face burn with humiliation as several family members turned to look at me with pity. I sat in the front pew of the church in Birmingham, Alabama, clutching the worn recipe box that Grandma had specifically requested I receive, while my sister Vivian made no attempt to hide her satisfaction at what she believed was her superior inheritance. My name is Selena Parker, and at 32 years old I thought I understood my family well enough to expect this kind of treatment. For as long as I could remember, Vivian had been the golden child, the one who received praise for simply showing up while I worked tirelessly in the background. Today, at our grandmother's funeral, that dynamic was playing out one final time, and I could feel the familiar sting of being dismissed as the lesser daughter. Poor Selena, I heard Aunt Dorothy murmur to her husband, always got the short end of the stick even in death. Vivian's friends giggled quietly, and I watched my sister's eyes gleam with triumph as she adjusted the expensive black dress she'd bought specifically for today. She'd arrived from Atlanta just yesterday, her first visit to Birmingham in over 6 months, carrying herself with the air of someone who expected to walk away significantly wealthier. The contrast between us couldn't have been more obvious. There she sat surrounded by admirers, while I sat alone with a collection of yellowed index cards and handwritten recipes for casseroles and desserts. At least the jewelry collection will be worth something substantial, Vivian had announced to anyone who would listen during the viewing the night before. Grandma always said those pieces were family heirlooms. Some of them are probably worth thousands. I had said nothing then, just as I said nothing now. But something about Grandma's final wishes felt different. There had been an unusual gleam in her eyes during our last conversation 3 weeks ago, when she'd made me promise to take care of the cookbooks. "Promise me, sweetheart," she'd said, gripping my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Promise me you'll treasure every single recipe in that box." The funeral director was preparing to escort everyone to the lawyer's office for the reading of the will, and I could see Vivian practically vibrating with anticipation. She'd already made plans for how she would sell the more valuable pieces, keeping only her favorites for herself. As we filed out of the church, I noticed she kept glancing at the recipe box in my hands with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction, as if my inheritance was proof of my place in the family hierarchy. The years leading up to this moment had established a clear pattern in our family, one that made Vivian's behavior today feel like an inevitable conclusion to a lifelong story of favoritism and neglect. While she'd moved to Atlanta after college to pursue her marketing career, visiting only during major holidays and special occasions, I had remained in Birmingham, building my life around caring for the people who mattered most to me. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 5 years, I'd driven the 20 minutes from my downtown apartment to Grandma's house on the south side of the city, helping her with grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, and the general maintenance that comes with aging. While Vivian sent Christmas cards and made brief phone calls on birthdays, I'd spent countless afternoons sitting at Grandma's kitchen table, listening to stories about her childhood, and learning the family recipes that had been passed down through generations. "You're the only one who really cares about preserving family traditions," Grandma had told me repeatedly over the years. "Vivian's too busy with her important career to bother with an old woman's recipes." Those afternoons had become precious to me, not because I particularly enjoyed cooking, but because they represented the only time I felt truly valued by someone in my family. Grandma would pull out her recipe box and walk me through the preparation of her famous Sunday pot roast or her celebrated apple pie, insisting that I write down every detail in my own handwriting. "Recipes aren't just about ingredients," she'd say. "They're about love and memory and connection." Vivian, meanwhile, had always treated these visits as proof of my limited ambitions. "Still playing housewife with Grandma?" she'd ask whenever she called during one of my visits. "Don't you have anything better to do with your time?" Her tone carried the implication that my devotion to family traditions was somehow embarrassing, a sign that I lacked the sophisticated priorities that had taken her to the big city in the corporate world. Our parents had always reinforced this dynamic, praising Vivian's professional achievements while treating my work as a social worker like a temporary phase I'd eventually outgrow. "When are you going to find something more substantial?" my father would ask during family dinners. "Vivian's already climbing the corporate ladder, and you're still dealing with other people's problems." The favoritism had been particularly evident during Grandma's decline over the past year. While I'd coordinated her medical care, arranged for home health services, and spent my weekends helping her organize decades of accumulated belongings, Vivian had contributed occasional phone calls and a few expensive flower arrangements. Yet somehow she'd maintained her position as the family success story, the daughter whose accomplishments were celebrated, while my sacrifices were taken for granted. Now, as we walked toward the lawyer's office, I could feel the weight of those years of dismissal. Vivian strode confidently beside her friends, already discussing her plans for the inheritance, while I followed quietly behind, wondering if even in death, Grandma's final gesture would reinforce my position as the forgotten daughter. The lawyer's office occupied the third floor of a historic building in downtown Birmingham, its mahogany paneled walls and heavy leather furniture, creating an atmosphere of solemnity that seemed appropriate for the occasion. Mr. Harrison had been handling our family's legal affairs for over 2 decades, and his kind eyes held a mixture of professional compassion and something else I couldn't quite identify. As we settled into the conference room, Vivian had positioned herself prominently at the head of the table, flanked by her friends, who'd driven down from Atlanta for what they clearly expected to be a celebratory occasion. I took a seat near the window, still clutching the recipe box, feeling like an observer at someone else's important meeting. The contrast in our expectations couldn't have been more obvious. While Vivian radiated confidence and entitlement, I simply hoped to get through the reading without further embarrassment. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today," Mr. Harrison began, adjusting his glasses as he opened the thick folder containing Grandma's will. Margaret Ann Patterson was a remarkable woman who thought very carefully about how she wanted to distribute her estate. Vivian leaned forward eagerly, and I noticed her friends exchanging knowing glances. They'd obviously discussed their expectations during the drive from Atlanta, probably calculating the value of various pieces and planning a shopping trip to celebrate Vivian's good fortune. The assumption that I'd received the consolation prize, a box of old recipes, seemed to amuse them, and I caught several poorly concealed smiles directed in my direction. "The primary bequests are straightforward," the lawyer continued. "To my granddaughter Vivian Patterson Hughes I leave my complete collection of jewelry, including all pieces inherited from my own mother and grandmother, along with my personal savings account containing approximately $15,000. Vivian's smile widened, and she actually clapped her hands together in delight. I knew Grandma understood who really deserved the family treasures, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Her friends murmured, "Congratulations," and I felt the familiar ache of being overlooked, even though I tried to prepare myself for this moment. "To my granddaughter Selena Patterson," Mr. Harrison continued, "I leave my recipe collection including all handwritten cards, the wooden box they're stored in, and any additional materials related to food preparation and cooking that might be found among my possessions." The disappointment in the room was palpable, and I saw several family members exchange sympathetic looks. Aunt Dorothy reached over to pat my shoulder consolingly, while Vivian made no attempt to hide her satisfaction. "Well, at least you'll always be able to make a good casserole," she said with mock sweetness, generating another round of barely suppressed laughter from her supporters. But as I looked at Mr. Harrison's face, I noticed something unexpected. His expression wasn't one of sympathy or regret. Instead, he seemed to be suppressing what looked almost like anticipation, as if the real purpose of today's gathering hadn't yet been revealed. The way he handled the folder suggested there were additional documents, additional surprises that nobody in the room had considered. "However, Mr. Harrison said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that immediately commanded everyone's attention, "there are additional provisions in Margaret Patterson's will that require explanation, particularly regarding the, shall we say, unique nature of Miss Selena's inheritance." The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Where moments before he'd seemed to be delivering routine information, now there was an energy in his voice that suggested something significant was about to unfold. I felt my heartbeat quicken, though I couldn't understand why. What could possibly be unique about inheriting a box of family recipes? Vivian, who had been basking in the congratulations of her friends, suddenly looked puzzled. "What do you mean by unique?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "They're just old recipe cards. What's there to explain?" "Well, that's where things become quite interesting," Mr. Harrison replied, reaching into his briefcase to retrieve a second folder, much thicker than the first. Your grandmother was an extraordinarily clever woman, Miss Hughes. She spent the better part of 2 years working with me to ensure that her most valuable assets would be transferred to the granddaughter, who had demonstrated the greatest commitment to family and the most genuine character. The room fell silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but now the looks weren't filled with pity. Instead, there was confusion, curiosity, and in Vivian's case, the first hint of alarm. Her friends had stopped their celebratory murmuring and were leaning forward with sudden interest. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. What assets? Grandma lived modestly. Besides the jewelry and her savings, what else could there be? Mr. Harrison smiled then, and it was a smile filled with genuine warmth and what I could only describe as anticipation. Miss Patterson, your grandmother owned significantly more than anyone in your family realized. Over the past 15 years, she made a series of very astute real estate investments throughout Birmingham and the surrounding areas. 6 rental properties, 2 commercial buildings, and a small shopping center that generates substantial monthly income. The words hit the room like a physical force. Vivian's face went pale and her mouth fell open in shock. That's impossible, she stammered. Grandma never mentioned any properties. She lived in the same small house for 40 years. How could she own rental properties? Your grandmother was very private about her investments, the lawyer explained. She preferred to let people assume she was living on a modest pension, while she quietly built a substantial real estate portfolio. The properties are currently valued at approximately $4.20 $2 million, and they generate around $35,000 per month in rental income. I felt dizzy. The numbers seemed impossible, surreal. My grandmother, who had clipped coupons and shopped for markdown groceries, who had worried about paying for her medications, had been a millionaire. But why didn't she tell me? I asked, struggling to process this revelation. Why keep it secret? Because Mr. Harrison said, opening the recipe box I'd been clutching throughout the meeting. She wanted to see which granddaughter would value family traditions and genuine connection over material expectations, and she wanted to protect her assets using a method that would ensure they went to the right person. He began pulling recipe cards from the box, but as he laid them on the table, I could see they weren't ordinary index cards. Each one was thicker than normal paper, more formal in appearance, and covered in what looked like official stamps and signatures alongside the handwritten recipes. Miss Patterson, he said, looking directly at me, every recipe card in this box is also a legal property deed. Your grandmother spent months working with me to create this system. Each recipe corresponds to one of her properties with the cooking instructions written on one side, and the legal property transfer documentation on the other. The silence in the room was absolute. I stared at the recipe card spread across the conference table, trying to comprehend what Mr. Harrison was telling me. Each innocent-looking index card, yellowed with age and covered in Grandma's familiar handwriting, represented property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This can't be real, Vivian said, her voice rising with panic. You're saying she disguised property deeds as recipes? That's ridiculous. It doesn't make legal sense. On the contrary, Mr. Harrison replied calmly. It makes perfect legal sense. Your grandmother worked with my firm for over 2 years to ensure every document was properly executed and recorded. Each recipe card contains both the cooking instructions your grandmother actually used and the legal language necessary to transfer ownership of the corresponding property to Miss Selina. He picked up one of the cards and handed it to me. This one, for instance, contains your grandmother's recipe for apple pie. But if you look at the backside, you'll find the deed transferring ownership of the commercial building on 20th Street South, currently leased to a medical practice and generating $4,800 per month in rental income. My hands trembled as I turned the card over. Sure enough, beneath the familiar recipe for Margaret's famous apple pie was dense legal text describing property boundaries, transfer conditions, and my name as the new owner. The official county seal and notary stamp made it unmistakably legitimate. The recipe for beef stew, the lawyer continued, selecting another card, corresponds to the duplex on Highland Avenue. The chocolate chip cookies represent the 4-unit apartment building in 5 Points. Each recipe your grandmother taught you over the years was simultaneously a lesson in cooking and a legal transfer of substantial wealth. Vivian stood up so abruptly that her chair fell backward. "This is insane," she shouted, her composure completely shattered. "She can't just hide millions of dollars in property transfers. I'm going to contest this. There has to be some legal recourse." "Actually," Mr. Harrison said, his voice remaining professionally calm despite Vivian's outburst, "your grandmother anticipated that reaction. That's why she documented everything so thoroughly. There's also this letter." He handed me an envelope with my name written in Grandma's careful script. Inside was a 3-page letter that began with the words I'd been longing to hear my entire life. "My dearest Selena, you are the granddaughter who truly understood what family means." As I read aloud, my voice growing stronger with each sentence, the letter detailed exactly why Grandma had chosen this method of inheritance. She described my years of devotion, my genuine interest in family traditions, and my character as someone who valued relationships over material gain. She contrasted this with Vivian's behavior, noting her infrequent visits, her dismissive attitude toward family recipes, and her obvious interest in monetary inheritance rather than emotional connection. I watched both of my granddaughters carefully, the letter continued, and I saw that Selena was the one who would treasure these recipes, not for their financial value, but for the love and history they represented. I designed this inheritance to reward genuine devotion, and to ensure that my properties would go to someone who would manage them responsibly and continue to value family above all else. The letter concluded with specific instructions for each property, including details about the current tenants, rental agreements, and Grandma's hopes for how I would continue her legacy of providing quality housing to working families in Birmingham. Vivian's friends had grown completely silent, staring at the scene unfolding before them with obvious shock. The woman they'd come to congratulate on her inheritance was now facing the reality that she'd received jewelry worth perhaps $50,000, while the sister she'd mocked had inherited a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. "No," Vivian said, her voice breaking as the full magnitude of her miscalculation became clear. "This isn't fair. I'm the successful one. I'm the one with the career and the connections. Selena just stayed here and played house with an old woman. That doesn't make her deserve millions of dollars." Her friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no longer sure whether to offer support or distance themselves from her mounting humiliation. The celebration they'd anticipated had transformed into a public breakdown, and I could see them exchanging uncertain glances as Vivian's facade of sophistication crumbled completely. "Miss Hughes," Mr. Harrison said firmly, "your grandmother's decision was based on her observation of both granddaughters over many years. She valued Miss Selena's consistent presence, her genuine care, and her appreciation for family traditions. The method she chose to transfer her assets reflects her belief that the most important inheritances aren't always the most obvious ones." I was still processing the enormity of what had just happened, but one thing was becoming crystal clear. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon I'd spent at Grandma's house. Every recipe I'd carefully copied into my own handwriting. Every conversation about family history and cooking techniques had been part of an elaborate test. And somehow, without even knowing I was being evaluated, I had passed the recipe for Sunday pot roast. I said softly, picking up another card and examining both sides. "This was always my favorite. Grandma made me practice it so many times. That recipe corresponds to the shopping center on Green Springs Highway," Mr. Harrison confirmed. "Your grandmother purchased it 8 years ago and spent considerable time renovating it to attract quality tenants. It's currently fully occupied and generates approximately $12,000 monthly in rental income." Vivian sank back into her chair, her face white with shock and rage. "She tricked me," she whispered. "She made me think the jewelry was the valuable inheritance. She let me believe that Selena was getting scraps while I was getting the treasure." "Your grandmother didn't trick anyone," I said, finding my voice as the reality of the situation settled in. "She simply gave each of us exactly what we valued most. You wanted material wealth that you could display and sell. I wanted connection and tradition and family history. She made sure we both got what we truly cared about." The lawyer began organizing the recipe cards back into their box, but now each one felt precious in an entirely new way. "Miss Patterson, there are additional documents you'll need to review, including current lease agreements, property management recommendations, and tax information. Your grandmother has left you not just substantial wealth, but also the responsibility of maintaining her legacy as a fair and conscientious landlord. As Vivian and her friends prepared to leave, the atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. Where they'd entered expecting triumph, they were now departing in stunned silence. Vivian paused at the door, looking back at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This isn't over," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'll find a way to challenge this. It's not right that someone who never accomplished anything should inherit everything." "Actually," Mr. Harrison interjected quietly, "Miss Selena accomplished exactly what your grandmother valued most. She showed up. She cared. She listened. She preserved family traditions not because she expected a reward, but because she understood their importance. In your grandmother's opinion, those are the greatest accomplishments of all." As the door closed behind them, I sat alone with the lawyer and the recipe box that had just changed my entire life. Finally understanding that Grandma's greatest gift wasn't the properties or the money. It was the validation that my choices, my values, and my devotion had been seen, appreciated, and rewarded. Within hours of the will reading, news of the cookbook inheritance had spread throughout Birmingham's tight-knit community like wildfire, and the reactions were everything I could have hoped for in terms of vindication. Aunt Dorothy called me that evening, barely able to contain her amazement. "Selena, honey, I can't believe it. All those years we thought your grandmother was just getting by on Social Security and she was building an empire and she left it all to you because you were the only one who really cared about her." The irony wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed Vivian's behavior at the funeral. Within a week, the story had become local legend. The granddaughter, who mocked her sister's inheritance of worthless cookbooks, had unknowingly dismissed millions of dollars in real estate, while the sister she'd pied had become one of Birmingham's wealthiest young property owners overnight. My phone rang constantly with congratulations from family members, friends, and even acquaintances who had heard the story. "I always knew your grandmother saw something special in you," my former high school teacher told me when she called. "The way you used to talk about those afternoons at her house. Anyone could see you genuinely treasured that time together." Meanwhile, Vivian had retreated to Atlanta in humiliation, her social media account suddenly quiet after years of posting about her professional achievements and material acquisitions. Her friends, who had driven down expecting to celebrate her windfall, had instead witnessed her complete meltdown and public exposure, as someone who had fundamentally misunderstood her own family dynamics. The legal challenge she'd threatened never materialized. Her attorney, after reviewing Grandma's meticulous documentation and the ironclad nature of the property transfers, had apparently advised her that contesting the will would only result in expensive legal fees and further public embarrassment. Every recipe card had been properly notarized, recorded with the county, and executed according to Alabama state law. More satisfying than the money, though, was the recognition that my years of devotion had been noticed, valued, and rewarded in the most thoughtful way imaginable. 6 months after the inheritance revelation, I found myself sitting in the same kitchen where Grandma had taught me those precious recipes, now fully understanding the profound gift she had given me. The house itself wasn't part of the inheritance. That had gone to my parents, but I'd purchased it from them using rental income from my properties, ensuring that the heart of our family's traditions would remain intact. Every month, as I collected rent checks totaling over $35,000, I thought about Vivian's cruel whisper at the funeral. Grandma only left her old cookbooks. The phrase that had been intended to humiliate me had become the foundation of my financial independence and the proof of Grandma's incredible foresight. I'd kept my job as a social worker, at least for now, because the work gave my life meaning beyond the properties, but the inheritance had given me options I'd never dreamed possible. I could afford to take cases that mattered to me without worrying about the pay. I could make donations to causes I cared about. I could travel, pursue education, or start a family without financial anxiety. Most importantly, I'd maintain Grandma's legacy exactly as she'd hoped. I'd kept the same property management company she'd used, continued her practice of fair rent prices for working families, and even used some of the income to establish a small scholarship fund for first-generation college students in Birmingham. The recipe box sat prominently on my kitchen counter now, each card a reminder not just of cooking techniques, but of the deeper lesson Grandma had taught me, that the most valuable inheritances are often disguised as simple gifts, and that genuine love and devotion are always recognized and rewarded, even when we least expect it. The sweet taste of justice had proven more satisfying than any recipe Grandma had ever taught me to make. Vivian and her friends faced lasting social embarrassment when word spread throughout Atlanta's professional circles about her public breakdown at the funeral and her gross miscalculation of the inheritance values, damaging her reputation as someone who claimed to be sophisticated and successful, but had completely failed to understand her own family dynamics. Her financial expectations were permanently shattered when she realized that her jewelry inheritance, while sentimental, was worth less than what I now earned in rental income every 2 weeks, making her previous boasts about deserving the valuable family assets appear foolish and short-sighted. The family members who had always favored her achievements over my devotion were forced to confront the reality that Grandma's careful assessment of our characters had been devastatingly accurate. While Vivian struggled with the knowledge that her dismissive attitude toward family traditions had cost her millions of dollars and exposed her as someone who valued appearances over genuine relationships. As I prepared Sunday dinner using Grandma's pot roast recipe, the same one that had transferred ownership of a shopping center worth over $800,000, I reflected on how perfectly she had orchestrated this final lesson about the true nature of family loyalty. Understanding that sometimes the most profound revenge comes not from our own actions, but from allowing others to reveal their character so completely that justice serves itself.